Good morning, everyone. I am Laura Winter with St. Louis Graduates. Nice to see you. I am joined today by my colleagues from MASFAP, Kayla Klein from Mizzou, and Alex Miller from Columbia College, who are actually going to host our session today. So I'll be running technology behind the scenes. Already had a question about what the playlist is that we were listening to this morning, and I will put that into the chat. And if you have any questions, just let us know. Just a reminder to mute yourselves as well. Thanks so much for joining us. And Kayla, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday, right? Yay, it's the weekend. If you're in Columbia, Mizzou football is tomorrow, so it's like crazy around here. So we'll go get started. We'll keep you guys on time. We like to respect your time and those kinds of things, so just keep that in mind. We'll start with kind of our agenda and kind of go through what we're going to do today. So we're going to do the welcome and the housekeeping. That's me. Hi. We're going to take a deep breath before we start and kind of get ready to get dived into this whole training session. We're going to do some breakout groups, get to know a colleague, kind of ask them a question. It's a quick 5-minute, like, hi, how you doing thing. And then Buddy Mayfield, Charles Mayfield, I call him Buddy, and Becca Diskin are going to be our presenters today, and they both are going to give you guys some great information about supporting students with special circumstances and COVID-19 impacts and things that are kind of impacting us, but we know are also impacting you guys as well. So we want to make sure we give you those resources. We'll do some announcements and resources at the end, and then we'll kind of do a wrap up and adjourn. So we'll keep you on time, and we want to make sure if you do have questions, put those in the chat. We do have somebody monitoring that, and we'll make sure we get you responded to if we don't do it right now. So housekeeping, make sure you guys give yourself grace. We get it. You're probably working from home. There are little ones, dogs, cats. They are more than welcome to join the meeting. Just make sure you're on mute so we can make sure we keep going through the process. Make sure that you abide by the PDI meeting agreement, and Laura has put that in the chat for us today. So make sure that you read through that. If you have questions, let us know. And please use the chat function to reach out to us, ask questions. We're monitoring it. Just so you know, the private chat is not private. It does show up in our chat log, so just an FYI for that. We are recording the session, so if there's anybody that maybe can't attend or you'd like to share it with them afterwards because you feel like it's great information that they need, we'll send a link out after this meeting. And please complete the evaluation survey. So we're doing a lot of these. We want to know what you're wanting to know, what we can improve on, what we need to get better, but we're really trying to make sure we connect get your guys' questions answered. So just make sure you get that into us. The other thing I would say is when we start sending out these things, also share the links with people. Invite people to join that you think would benefit from these as well. The more the merrier. We like to have fun. So the Professional Development Institute, you can join us. Like I said, we do have workshops coming up. So the ones that we're partnering with St. Louis Graduates on, we'll have another one on October 9th. That's going to be FAFSA completion and verification strategies. So that one's going to probably be very important. That's right after FAFSA opens, so just keep that in mind. November 20th, we're going to do a financial aid and student support resources. So we've invited Missouri Department of Higher Education, or DUDE as they're now referred to, MOCAN, Scholarship Central, to kind of give you a presentation on what they're each doing. I know a lot of you probably have questions about the FAFSA completion process that's going on through the Department of Ed, so it's going to give them time to give you kind of what's going on with that. MOCAN is new. If you haven't heard of them, it's the Missouri College Access Network, so we want to give you time to get to know them as well. I would highly recommend still attending the ones that St. Louis Graduates is doing as well. So October 23rd, they're going to have a career pathways and advising strategies to connect with students. I will tell you, I get so much benefit out of listening to the ones that they present to, so make sure you join those. November 6th, they'll have a match and fit one. And then December 4th, they're going to do supporting undocumented youth. And if you've never seen Felipe present, I will tell you, mark your calendar for that one. He's amazing and is well worth your time. So we're going to start by taking a deep breath. Belly breathing is good for your brain, and we want to make sure that you are ready for this great wealth of knowledge we're about to give you. So you're going to place one hand on your chest and the other on your belly. I know it sounds funny. Everybody, don't look at each other on the camera if that makes you feel bad. And inhale deeply through your nose. Count for 4. And make sure you're expanding your stomach, breathe in real deep, and then you're going to exhale through your mouth for a count for 4. So kind of do that for a few minutes, get ready. It's helping to relieve that stress. Working from home, even, it can be stressful. So just make sure and calm and get ready to go so that we can get you this great information. All right, everyone feel de-stressed now? Get you ready to go. So we're going to do a quick check-in. This is kind of one of my favorite things. I call it like speed dating. That's the way I think of it. It's in a moment. You'll join. You'll be invited to join a separate breakout room. So it's good. I hope you guys got to talk a little bit. My group was great. I learned a little bit about what they're going through. And I know everybody's a little different, but it's some crazy things. And in the reality, we're all going through the same thing. So I have the pleasure of introducing 2 of my favorite people that have helped me in my financial aid career a ton, and I've learned a ton from them. And that is Becca Diskin, who's the Director of Financial Aid at Missouri Southern State University, and Charles Buddy Mayfield, who's the Director of Financial Assistance at Northwestern Missouri State University. And when I say they're going to give you a lot of information, they will, but they will teach you. And I hope you guys all learn just as much from them as I do. And so I will turn it over to Becca and Buddy.
Thanks, Kayla. Hello, everybody. Good morning. We're going to kind of co-present to you for, I think, a 40-minute window. Is that right, Laura? Take about 40 minutes. Try to have time for you to ask questions, either audio, video, the chat. I think Laura said they're going to monitor chat. I'll try to do that. I'm sure Becca will try to watch it too out of the corners of our eye. But as Kayla mentioned, I work at Northwest Missouri State University. I've been here for 5 years. As I introduce myself for things like this, I try to provide a little bit of context. I would call Northwest a medium-sized four-year public. We've got about 7,000 students. Before this job, I worked at a four-year public that had about 45,000 students. And before that, my first financial aid job was at a four-year private school that had 1,500 students. And so those experiences have been different from school to school for me. I share that context for any questions that you have. Like Laura mentioned, we'll do our best to help you as much as we can, knowing that not every school in the country is like Northwest Missouri State University. So that's me.
Hi everyone, this is Becca Diskin. I am the Director of Financial Aid at Missouri Southern, and like Buddy, have been in the financial aid profession for quite some time. I've been here at Southern for 10 years now as the director, but prior to that, I also had experience working with USA Fund Services, and so I did a lot of training across the country to different colleges and universities. So I do have some experience in working with other folks that maybe don't have the same type of school setup as we do here at Southern. You know, we're a four-year public, we're about 5,000 to 6,000 students. And so relatively small in the grand scheme of things, but certainly in my travels and in my past jobs, I have definitely seen other schools do things very differently. The for-profits, the nonprofits, the privates, and community colleges all have their own unique blend of students. And so I certainly can appreciate that, like Buddy said, not all of us are going to do things exactly the same way. And I think some of the things we're going to talk about today will certainly have some similarities. And so we will try to share some of our insights from things we have seen in our experience, but also recognize that there is some latitude in some of these things, and the interpretation is somewhat broad and does give us some liberty at each school to make our own judgment based on the circumstances. And so the beauty of special circumstances is that we can look at students' individual family scenarios and their financial impacts on paying for college, and we can address them one-on-one rather than some blanket rule that may not fit everybody's bucket. But the hard part is that takes time, and that also takes connecting to the right people. And so hopefully you will find that financial aid administrators at any college or university are welcoming and open to any questions that you have and any of the families that you are helping, that our job really is to serve students and I think Buddy and I share the same idea that it really doesn't matter if they go to Northwest or go to Missouri Southern. Either way, we are here to help them. So students in our communities, we definitely help in a broader way, because we know sometimes we hold the answers to those tough questions and to those circumstances, and we want to help them go to college wherever they decide to go. So we'll kind of just lead in, I guess. I believe some of you have probably received some information from the past. I think in August there was some surveys issued that kind of helped us gain some information from St. Louis graduates that a lot of high school counselors and students that work with or other professionals that work with students that are going to college, that financial aid information is somewhat general everywhere, so there is a general comfort level there. But special circumstances and these kinds of things we're going to talk about today are very not easy, and sometimes so different that you don't know how to get into the weeds of all of that. And so we want to go over some of those things today to help increase your comfort level and to give you some context so that you know the right questions to ask on behalf of those students, and help to know how to refer them to those of us that work at the college level to help get them the support that they need financially speaking. So some of those questions that we will go through today relate to special circumstances. We also call those professional judgment. So you might hear some of those terms interchangeably today. Buddy and I are going to kind of tag team and share some of these topics today back and forth, so that you get some perspective of how special circumstances do work, and kind of what are some of the scenarios where special circumstances will come up in conversations. We know many households aren't clean cut, and many families have a lot of issues in pulling all of these financial details together to help someone fill out a FAFSA and pay for college. And so some of these questions here we will be addressing today in relation to independency status, parents' information. Sometimes the parent situations are kind of tricky. What happens if someone in the household loses a job or has a huge income shift that does change their information that's being reported, and how does that impact their financial aid? Of course, marital status can change from year to year from families, and so how does that impact the financial perspective? And then of course COVID, that little coronavirus thing that we're all kind of dealing with, and how that has impacted us at the college level. So we want to put some resources in place, and certainly Buddy and I will serve as contacts. Many of you do work with the FAFSA and the process of applying for financial aid on a regular basis. So again, some of this may be not new to you, but hopefully we'll dig into some of the tougher questions. And certainly if anyone has specific questions, put them in the chat so that we can get them addressed today for you. So our agenda, like I said, Buddy and I will kind of go back and forth and cover, these are the wide sweeping topics that we're going to talk about today. So we'll start off by talking about the less common types of independent students that we have. So as many of you probably already know, there's a series of questions on the FAFSA that determine whether a student is dependent or independent for the sake of assessing their financial need and determining their federal and other types of financial aid that are available. So automatically, things like being age 24 or over, being a married individual, having children that you support, all of those things are obviously easy to make someone independent. But some of these other things that are asked on the FAFSA can be a little trickier to determine. And whether a student is a non-traditional student, 23, maybe even 22, living outside of the parent's household, or someone who is coming right out of high school, all of these factors here could make them independent automatically. So of course we've got legal guardianship listed there. Students that have been in foster care since the age of 13 or any time after the age of 13 would qualify for independent status. We're going to talk today about the unaccompanied homeless youth in just a moment, more in depth, because that's a designation that many of you in high school probably have been familiarized with those federal actions. And then of course, anyone who's active duty military or deemed a veteran who has been discharged from the military from active duty would qualify. And then we have those situations where someone is taking care of another individual, whether they be pregnant or a parent themselves taking care of dependents. Those are statuses that could qualify them for independency as well. So that being said, let's dig in a little bit to unaccompanied homeless youth. This is a wide sweeping topic and issue that I think we've seen for many years now, where students don't have a regular fixed home. And so whether they're living couch to couch with friends, whether their parents are not in the picture and they really don't have a permanent place from the biological family, to stories of where we've heard families maybe living out of their car or in an RV park, or even a homeless shelter. So those types of scenarios, we can work with the FAFSA to provide them that unaccompanied homeless youth designation. The interesting part about this is a lot of this is determined through the McKinney-Vento Act, and we list the link there that gives you some more details as to how McKinney-Vento defines homeless. Because there are some parameters, you know, in which you can determine someone homeless or not. But I think at the high school level, many high school counselors probably are the ones that are left to determine if this is a situation where they need to apply that McKinney-Vento Act and document them officially in their records as a homeless youth. And so the benefit of that is if the high school has designated as an unaccompanied homeless youth, then that gives the college level, their first year of college, the ability to qualify them as homeless and exclude their family income, their parent information from being utilized on the FAFSA. So that allows them to be independent in their own right. There are cases where that's not always documented well. And I think that's kind of what we want to talk about today, are those things where it's not always easy to just answer the question yes or no, because it's harder to document. If you do say yes, then many of the colleges and financial aid offices are going to ask, why did you say yes to that question? And so the next slide will show you a little bit more about how the FAFSA determines that. So it is a series of yes or no questions, and how the student answers that question then determines whether they go forward and ask for that parental information or not. And so ultimately, if they really are a homeless youth with no fixed regular home and have been that way for some time, then we have the liberty of excluding their parent information. So getting to those FAFSA questions and making sure the students are answering those questions correctly can go a long way to helping us determine whether we need to collect documentation from them or not. So I think the next slide then helps us look at what that documentation might be. So if this high school has determined them a homeless youth through the McKinney-Vento Act, then we have that documentation that we can get from the high school. And many times the high school counselor can send it right over to us. Sometimes the student carries it with them. And then that way we have that to work on their first year of their FAFSA application. In subsequent years, we may need to look at things a little differently. If the student is not designated by their high school through the McKinney-Vento Act, there could be public housing, or like this says, an emergency shelter or some sort of homeless program in the community that can provide documentation that yes, the student has lived here. And even if they have lived with their family there for a period of time, that could be helpful. And of course, if a student lives in any type of a youth center or transitional living program where they have been taken out of their home for a variety of reasons, generally because of homelessness, then those types of documentation can be very helpful to document those questions as well. So there are lots of ways that we try to work with students to gather this information. I know sometimes these are very delicate conversations, and so we generally don't deal with the student necessarily all by themselves. There's usually a support person. You all that work with college-bound students definitely have the ability to be that liaison for them. Now, Buddy, did you have any examples of documentation or things that you wanted to share about the homeless youth piece?
We receive, because Northwest enrolls a lot of traditional 18 to 22-year-old students, the vast majority of the homeless situations we come across are documented by the high school homeless liaison. We're also in a rural part of the state, and because of that, we're less likely to get the letter from the emergency shelter director or the somebody at a youth basic center that serves homeless youth. So we see a lot from the high schools, since each high school district has that homeless liaison, and they put a letter on their letterhead, and then we let the student continue through with that status from year to year, because it got documented at that point. And we just follow up with the student each year and ask them whether anything has changed in their living situation. And if nothing has changed, if it's still relatively similar to what it was the year before, then that'll carry through to sophomore, junior, and senior year.
All right, let's move on to our next agenda item, which is talking about who is the parent on the FAFSA.
The U.S. Department of Education put this infographic out. In one sense, the who is my parent seems like it could be a straightforward question for a lot of people. But we'll talk about who is my financial aid parent. And sometimes that question is not quite as easy to answer. And I think this infographic does a good job of helping students navigate that question and that process. I'll start by touching on the info at the bottom. It might be just as important to know who can't be considered a financial aid parent. Sometimes students are raised by an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, and those people, unless they've adopted the student, would not be considered a financial aid parent. And some of those examples are listed there for you. We'll see every once in a while a student who lists an extended family member or somebody like a legal guardian as a parent. And if you remember back to some of those dependency questions we were talking about, that legal guardianship status will essentially mean there is no financial aid parent. The student will provide their info and they don't have to provide any parent info because they're in legal guardianship of somebody other than the parent. When there's a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or some other family member who raised them and there is no financial aid parent per se, our next section will get into a little more detail about what we call dependency override. So we'll get there in just a bit. As far as the flow chart, are your parents married to each other? Yes or no? Do they live together? Yes or no? And if they don't, you just provide the info for the parent that you reside with. There's a two-part support test when your parents don't live together. The first part of that support test is who did you live with most of the time during the last 12 months? And if it's exactly even, or you're not sure if you lived with one or the other more, then there's a financial support question. Which of the parents, if you're split exactly 6 months with each, which of those parents provided you more financial support? And that's the parent the student would use on their FAFSA. And then the very last question on the right-hand side with the two wedding rings, is this parent remarried? That becomes really important. We'll receive financial aid applications from students sometimes, and they'll say, my parents are divorced. And their biological parents, their two biological parents are divorced, but the parent they live with has remarried. And in that case, the step parent's information gets included with the biological parent that they live with. So that very last question can be really helpful because initially, like I said, some students will just right away, they'll think, yeah, my parents are divorced. And they'll proceed that way, not realizing the step parent's information needs to be included. So this flow chart is out there on the studentaid.gov website. We tried to include a version that's got enough detail or clear enough for you. You could reuse it if you needed to from the presentation that Laura shared. So hopefully it's good enough quality copy and paste that you can see everything there and reuse it if you need to. We'll jump to dependency overrides on our agenda, and I'll hand it back to Becca. This is that scenario where you look at the independency questions and the student isn't an independent student. And then you look at the who is my parent flow chart and you really can't identify that there is a parent in the situation. And in this case, then you work with the school on a very case-by-case process. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Becca.
Okay. Well, as we talk a little bit about dependency overrides, I think it is true that, you know, we have a lot of students who not realizing that this can be this complicated, that whoever they live with is just who they should be providing as the parent. And it might be actually their grandparent or their aunt and uncle or their foster parents. And so it's important to have that distinction from our level and from your level so that we can determine whether that is the correct person's information to put on the FAFSA or not. So as we dive a little deeper into the dependency override, this falls under the umbrella of professional judgment. So professional judgment is kind of the broad sweeping authority that the Department of Education gives us at the school level for financial aid administrators to change the FAFSA in a exception status, kind of an override, in order to allow us to make the reported income correct, truly to their situation. And so sometimes that's because of year-to-year changes. Sometimes it's because of this parental situation being a little tricky, like we've talked about. And so we're going to dig a little deeper into what those things of professional judgment might look like so that you can help make those referrals to us as needed. So the first one I think we'll talk about is dependency override. That is a type of professional judgment where, like Buddy was saying, one of those parent categories applies to the student, but they're not really considered the financial aid parent. So the case of grandparents that have been raising this student, or another family member that is not the biological parents, but they've never adopted them legally, and there really is no court documentation to support that they've been placed in their custody as legal guardian, then we're kind of stuck with, we've got to make something happen for them because they really shouldn't be using those non-biological parents on the FAFSA, but yet that's who's providing their household support. So in that case, we do have the ability to do a dependency override for those folks. We do ask for a lot of documentation in order to make those decisions. I think I can speak for every school that I've ever known does require some additional documentation from students and these other family members or others close to the situation that can help verify that this is true and this is in fact how they've came to this point in life. So most of the time, I know here at Southern we require a statement from the student kind of explaining their request for the dependency override. Why would they be asking for it? So they tell a little bit about their personal situation and kind of how they came to be living with these folks or found themselves without parental information to collect. And then we require some outside documentation from someone that's not the student. So whether that be their high school counselor or one of you all providing some support because you have some history with them, you've been working with them from year to year and you know their family situation a little better. Could be a family friend, it could be their grandmother or others, sister, brother, aunt, uncle, others close to the situation that can verify that. And also sometimes it's just a close family friend or maybe a pastor or minister, someone who has counseled this person and understands the trueness of their family dynamic. And then of course, we want to verify that the student's income is correct. So we want to go ahead and dig a little deeper as to how they are supporting themselves or finding out how they are able to take care of the expenses that they may have if they're solely taking care of it on their own. So the next slide, I think, gets into kind of how the FAFSA explains why a dependency override is or is not an unusual circumstance that would be qualifying them. So it's important probably right out of the gate that we do have students who just don't have parents helping them pay for college. And that alone is not enough basis to do a dependency override. So even if the student moves out, is paying for all of their bills on their own, but is still 18 or 19 years old, the government, the Department of Education on the FAFSA still expects a custodial parent to provide their FAFSA information unless there are these other unusual type scenarios. So even if a student's taking care of their own expenses all by themselves by choice, or the parents have removed them from their home and says you're on your own, you have to take care of yourself, the expectation is that the custodial parents will still provide FAFSA information. So we have to kind of dig deeper and ask some difficult situation questions to find out what those circumstances are. I think the best way for me to explain a dependency override to someone who doesn't understand all those details is to find out if there has been abuse, neglect, maybe incarceration of the parent, or abandonment in some situation. Usually a dependency override results from one of those four things: abuse, neglect, incarceration, or abandonment. If the parents, the custodial parents, have not provided those four extreme situations, most of the time the student will still remain dependent, and one of those parents needs to provide their information on the FAFSA. So there is kind of a fine line there, especially if there's some dissension in the family or people that are not getting along. It can be kind of difficult to explain to a young person that even though their parents have refused to help them, that doesn't automatically qualify them to fill out the FAFSA all by themselves and exclude the parents from completing that. So that's why we go to that next step and have to ask for the documentation to help us clarify exactly where their situation's coming from. Is it truly, you know, an unfortunate hardship that has resulted them in this situation, or is it just the nature of some folks not getting along, and that we still need to kind of work with the family to help get that information on the FAFSA. Is there anything else that you want to mention on dependency override, Buddy, that I haven't covered here?
One thing that comes to mind, sometimes there is a parent willingness to pay. There's a parent willingness to be involved, but there also is an abusive or unsafe living environment for the student. So it might not be safe for the student to collect that info from their parent. And that's part of the reason in those 4 items that Becca listed, that parent willingness or unwillingness to pay for college, it can't be the deciding factor on how we move forward. We actually, I use this as an example. It's a very extreme and unfortunate one, but when the Jerry Sandusky scenario happened at Penn State, he had a college age son, close to college age. And we actually used that as an opportunity at one of our staff meetings to have a conversation around, what if a student came into our office and told us something like that and said nobody knew about it? They had been abused for most of their life, but there had never been law enforcement involvement. There had never been Division of Family Service involvement. What would we do, and how would we react, and how could we assist and help that student? So we kind of use that as an opportunity for a conversation, because if you've got that kind of scenario, we can still help that student. We just have to figure out how to navigate that particular situation that environment they've been living in, because sometimes the student will say to us, there are strings attached. If I let my parent help me through this process, then they've got that to hold over me, and that's not an environment that I want to go back to and that I want to be a part of. So that's the piece that right away comes to mind for me. Just because the parent is supportive and willing doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be included in the process.
Very good point.
So we'll jump from there into income changes, kind of shifting gears from one topic to another. So in this case, the context would be, we've determined there are parents involved in most cases if we're talking about high school seniors or the traditional age college student, and we'd be talking about a parent income change for one reason or another. Could be a job loss or a job change, one-time incomes that happen. When the student completes the FAFSA, they're going to report 2-year-old income data, and a lot can change in that 2-year window. So when you think about our seniors in high school right now, when they complete the FAFSA, they're going to report their 2019 income. And then when they enroll in college, we'll be in the year 2021 come next August. And so there's about a 2-year gap there, and a lot could have changed. In any 2-year window, a lot can change. In this 2-year window, it's exponentially different in how much can change and what families are experiencing in unemployment and furloughs and layoffs and those kind of things. The other high level thing that comes to mind to share is that thinking about that 2-year window, it's not uncommon for financial aid offices now to make changes and need to make changes in 2 consecutive years. So if you think about that family in 2021, things are different than 2019. When you fast forward another year and they go to report their 2020 income, it might still be very different for that second consecutive year. And so we end up making changes in back-to-back years. For this slide, the last thing I'll touch on are what you can categorize as consumer expenses. Sometimes families live at an appropriate level for their income. Sometimes they live beyond their means. and we come across scenarios where families will tell us they don't have a lot of money to pay for college, and when you have a conversation with them and you're really trying to figure out why, it's because they're making a choice to spend some portion of their money on things that the Department of Education doesn't account for. They expect you to spend a certain amount of your income on living expenses, a certain amount on food, a certain amount on education. It becomes part of that pie chart, if you want to visualize it that way, and how you spend your money. And so those consumer living expenses are something the financial aid office can't and won't typically account for. The FAFSA, you'll notice, includes lots of questions about family and income and assets and ability to pay, but it doesn't ask the value of the house you live in. It doesn't ask for your mortgage payment. It doesn't ask for how much do you pay for your car every month. It doesn't ask for anything about expenses because it's focused on that expected ability to pay, assuming the family is living at the right level based on their means. I may have, let's see here. The financial aid office has a framework. I guess I'll frame it that way. There's a framework that we work within, and I'll apply that in a particular way at Northwest, and Becca will apply that in a particular way at Missouri Southern. We'll try to touch on those consistencies and those similarities, and then also speak on a little bit on what could be potential differences. One example I could share is at one school, they might use something like a 3-year rolling average. This could be particularly helpful for maybe a self-employed parent or somebody who owns a family business or family farm, and their income might fluctuate normally from one year to the next a little bit, but it's been pretty significant lately, and so they might use a 3-year rolling average to see what is the family's sort of average ability to pay. At Northwest, what we end up doing most of the time is we skip that middle year. We'll look at 2019, and we're going to try to project the 2021 income. What does their current right now situation look like? And that year in between that we skip just gets overlooked. They may have had a higher income that year or lower, but we'll try to look at where are they right now today. And that doesn't usually work as well. Like I mentioned, those self-employed people, the business owners, the farmers, partway through the year, it might be very difficult. If they work on commission, it might be very difficult to calculate what their expected income will be. So the financial aid office will use different kinds of strategies to help those students through that process. And then we can share, on the next slide, we'll share some of the examples of things that we've seen in our offices. We can kind of hone in a little bit. We haven't talked a lot about one-time incomes. Sometimes families will do a retirement withdrawal or liquidation, maybe by choice, and sometimes not by choice. Sometimes we hear from families who change jobs, and that was part of the process in their job change. They liquidated retirement from one job and moved it to another one. Inheritance payments we see. Settlement could be from an injury or a lawsuit, or just a variety of different kinds of settlement payments that sometimes show up as taxable income. In those kind of one-time income scenarios, we'll work with the family to try to figure out how those funds were spent. If it was moved from one retirement account to the other, we can document that and remove that income from their financial aid application. I always use it's kind of a cliche example, but put a pool in the backyard. If they use that income for something like that, then I think most financial aid offices are probably going to say we have to leave that income in there, because you could have used part of that to help pay for your education instead of using it for a consumer expense. And so we look at why they spent that money or how they spent that money. Paying medical bills is another good example. I had to have surgery and I had to pay the medical bill. And so I had to withdraw some from my retirement account to be able to do that, because that was my only choice. And so a financial aid office can account for that kind of thing. We see income changes for divorce or separation of parents. And that one becomes a little more straightforward than some of the others, because we're just going to remove the parent's income who's no longer the custodial parent. And then only the custodial parent's income has to be reported. we do see every once in a while, we'll see a parent, if you think of a one income family and the parents are divorced or separated through this adjustment process, and the student stays with the custodial parent who had the family income in the one income family, we can remove that parent, but if that parent didn't have any income, then there's no income adjustment for us to make. So we have to look at those in, like we keep saying, individually and case by case over and over and over again, but hopefully some of these examples will kind of get gears turning for you and give you some comfort in knowing that you can connect them to us for more details, or you can help them a little bit along the way and then transition them over to somebody who works in a financial aid office. Natural disaster is another one that we come across sometimes. I'll use myself as an example, and I don't think Becca will mind I use her too. A couple of years ago, there was really bad flood in Nebraska, and almost the whole state of Nebraska was underwater. We're pretty close to Nebraska in Maryville, and we enroll students from Lincoln and Omaha and some parts of Nebraska. And so I called Becca and I asked her about the tornado that went through Joplin and what kinds of approaches and strategies did they take there when they were trying to help students, because it's something you can try to be prepared for, but you're not fully ready, and you don't ever know when something like that's going to happen. Especially that tornado in Joplin. One day everything's fine and the next day it's not. The flood you could see coming a little bit more because all the water came down from Nebraska and followed the Missouri River and came down through our part of the state. So those kinds of things we can account for. Sometimes we'll get into insurance conversations with families. We're trying to figure out how much financial hardship does the family have that's not going to be covered by insurance. And so we collect documentation for that in those kinds of cases. One example I can think of that was really a struggle for the family. They lived close to a railroad track, and something happened at the railroad, and they were working on it, and it sparked a fire, and it burned the family's home down. And they were in the middle of this big argument with the railroad company about whose fault it was and what part of the property is owned by the railroad and what part is owned by the family. And it took us a couple of months to get information from the railroad company in order for us to be able to move forward. And so we'll help the family through those kind of situations. Some of them aren't as easy as we'd like them to be. But the big thing to remember is that financial aid counselor, financial aid director, the financial aid staff are always going to be there to help the family through that process and be a representative of theirs. And even sometimes it's as simple as just knowing what questions to ask. In that example, when we got the railroad company on the phone finally, we were able to ask questions the family wouldn't have known to ask in that particular scenario. And so circling back to that financial aid office is really, really important. The last item here I'll touch on from a couple of angles. If a family's paying tuition at a private secondary school, we have the ability to account for that. Most financial aid offices are going to try to determine if that's a consumer spending choice or if it's something that's more in the reasonable or necessary for a family kind of category. An example I'll share, going back to a prior job, I worked in the state of Illinois for 3 years. And at that time, one of the school districts in that state lost their state accreditation, one of the public school districts there. And so some families felt like they needed to choose a different school because they thought the academic rigor and the accreditation and they needed to make that change. And so we'll look into that kind of thing at Northwest. That's sort of our process, is to try to figure out if did that family have other reasonable choices, or we call this a consumer spending decision. And so it kind of depends on where they live and what other school options were available in that location and for them, and status for the different school districts and kinds of things. So sometimes that can be adjusted, and then and sometimes it can't be. As Becca and I were kind of prepping for our session today, we kind of talked a little bit back and forth about the selectivity of an institution can even play into that policy. A really highly selective school, I think Ivy League concept, we think of them like the cream of the crop in our higher ed industry. They might enroll a lot of students that came from private secondary school and they have come from very affluent families, and they can afford to pay for the high cost education. But that doesn't apply to all students who attend private secondary school. And so we're trying to figure out how do we tease out those different kinds of scenarios and to make sure that we're helping the students who really need to be helped would be our goal there.
I think one of the other things just to keep in mind is that sometimes these conversations are ongoing. Sometimes when a crisis happens, or these kinds of, if someone just finds out their parents are getting divorced, they'll come to the financial aid office and they'll be all upset because everything's new and fresh and they don't know how they're going to finish paying for college. The whole situation seems insurmountable. We may have to help them through this situation immediately, but also to help prepare them for the fact that this is a long-term conversation. Their financial aid is year after year. We're going to continue to work with them for the long haul. And sometimes we have to wait until more things have happened in order to have a better judge on what the outlook is going to be to make that adjustment. So like kind of into Buddy's example, when you're talking about a natural disaster or even a change of income, the event might have just happened, but until things shake out a little bit and we know whether there's going to be unemployment income, whether there's going to be someone using retirement income, whether they're going to have insurance or some sort of payment that helps supplement the catastrophe, those things we may have to wait a little bit before we would make an adjustment to their financial aid. And so it's important to know we can't always act immediately, but we also can help them understand how the process works and what documentation they can start collecting so that we can help them for the year after year, because sometimes these situations cross over school years or tax years, and that we need to work with them on a couple of different FAFSA applications in order to make the best assessment of what financial aid they should have available. All right, so our last topic, which kind of parlays for what I was just talking about, is the world of COVID. And that certainly has caused us at the school level to have to make a lot of changes and adjustments, but it's also created an opportunity to put some additional funds in students' hands. And so as I was just saying, sometimes it takes a little bit for us to make adjustments and to collect documentation to give them more financial aid. I think the coronavirus has also put front and center that there are emergency grants available for students. And so we've had the benefit of qualifying for the CARES Act funding and been able to get some grants into students' hands earlier this spring. I think Northwest can speak to the same type of process, and that we had the application process available to many schools that we were able to help not only us for the costs that we at the school have incurred, but also to put some money into students' hands. And so, kind of in general terms, but more specifically to COVID, in any case, if a student has an unfortunate circumstance, whether it be something broad like coronavirus or something more specific to them, the financial aid office and the counselors that are here working with them at the school level are always available, whether it's the beginning of an academic year cycle or in the middle of their semester. We want to know those kinds of things so that we can plug in some resources for them to help them. Sometimes it's not always financial. Sometimes we need to get them in touch with a proper counselor to help them through the emotional crisis that they're dealing with. Sometimes we need to get them academic support so that they are having better conversations with their professors, or they're getting the support they need from a tutoring center or a disability services coordinator so that their professors understand that they may need some accommodations to do well in class. And so all of these things that we're talking about today kind of drum up a reason why a student won't perform well academically. And ultimately our job is to keep them in school and keep them progressing towards their degree. And many times it's financial, but many times it's not. There are other personal things. And so I feel like sometimes the financial aid office is the catch-all. We find out all kinds of personal things about someone because the finances is where the rubber meets the road, and that usually stops them from participating if they can't think that they're going to financially pay for it. So it allows us to plug in other things and to make sure that we're utilizing everything that we have available to help them. So I think Buddy and I can kind of share a little bit in light of COVID, some of the things that are happening on our college campuses and what's available. So I mentioned a little bit the emergency grant distributions. So I know I'm kind of starting in the middle of the slide there, but we definitely have been able to distribute funds to students as well as help reimburse ourselves for some of the things that we had to incur in a pinch as we transferred from on-campus to off-campus online remote environment really quickly in March this past spring. We are currently offering our fall courses online, but primarily on campus. We built every class this semester the way we normally would, but with the contingency that if we would need to shift to a completely online environment, we could. So a lot of our courses, depending on the professor's needs and the level of attention that each of those students need for the material, some of them have more of a hybrid or a high flex model where they may not come to class 3 days a week. They may come to class once or twice a week in order to separate people out and not be as large of a class at the same time. And we also moved a lot of classrooms around to larger spaces so that if a class of 20 was meeting in a classroom that only held 25, they're now meeting in a classroom that holds 50, so that that group of 20 or 25 can spread out and maintain the social distancing that's required. So we had a lot of shifting that happened in the classroom and just the way the class was set up to make sure that we could keep students safe every day that they are in class. Current enrollment certainly is definitely a concern. I think the uncertainty of students going to college certainly impacts us a lot as to how we predict and how we prepare for what our numbers are going to look like. I think every college is seeing some strange trends. This is not a normal projection that we can work from. I know here at Southern we did definitely see a decline. We were anticipating a decline in our enrollment for the fall semester, but interestingly enough, our freshman class is up by 3%. So we brought in more freshmen than we did last fall, but our overall numbers, so some of our returning students weren't able to continue this fall semester with some of the uncertainty. So I can see that parlaying into a future, certainly our future projections are going to have to be adjusted with coronavirus implications, because it's not going to be the same as what we can normally project. And Buddy, if you have any tidbits you want to share there, I think we're all kind of in a similar situation where most schools are seeing a true difference than what we have seen in the past. You can't really count on past projections to get us thinking this year and even next year is going to be anywhere near the same. Just there's so many uncertain contingencies that we're having to deal with.
Yeah, we've had some things that you would consider unsurprising, but we've had some surprises too. Our Northwest put out a press release this fall, a week or so ago, that said we have record enrollment, and that's not something you would have expected. Our freshman class was a little bit down, but for the last 3 years, we've had record retention in the history of the university. 4 years ago, we remodeled our entire scholarship program with more of a focus on retention and supporting the student with scholarships for all 4 years. And so that's really most of what's driving that press release, but it seems a really strange thing to say with everything happening. But it's really a result of the last 3 years. And our overall enrollment was up a few percent, and freshman enrollment was down a few percent. So we're kind of flip-flop from Missouri Southern scenario just because of our combination of circumstances. We're on campus for class this fall, face masks 6 feet apart, kind of mitigation stuff. We did get approval to travel up to 60 miles to do high school presentations. So I know we're up in the far corner of the state, and that doesn't do much help for the Kansas City folks on the call, or Columbia, or St. Louis, but our leadership approved us to travel within 60 miles to do high school presentations. So we've got 8 or 10 high schools that we've got presentations coming up for. And then the FAFSA Frenzy mentioned, when I looked last, the vast majority of the FAFSA Frenzy events throughout the state, it looked like they're going to be virtual. We decided to continue to hold ours on campus in person. We're in a laptop room that has about 100-person capacity, and we typically have 15 or 20 people at our FAFSA Frenzy. So we were able to document to our leadership that we'll be able to stay apart and wear masks, and they approved us to still offer that session in person to help them. I think we can hand it back to Laura, I think.
Certainly open for any questions that.
There is a question in the chat, and it says, are other schools giving more lenience to counselors to make decisions for students on behalf of students, or is the thinking more towards the directors to ensure consistency?
We, I can talk a little bit about what we've tried this year. We decided in the winter of last year, before COVID, we decided to try something on our campus to see how it would work and if it would work and how well it would work. We took out of our need-based scholarship budget, we have 5 full-time counselors in our financial aid office. We took $50,000 out of that budget and gave $10,000 to each of them to make those decisions on their own. This is our first year doing that. And so this fall, they're spending that money when they come across those kinds of cases. When we made that decision to make that change, we had no idea what was going to happen just a few months later. And so they're making those awards for COVID related reasons now, but that wasn't really our intent of that process. It was really to remove that red tape and remove that step in that process so that everything doesn't have to be funneled to the director, to give those counselors that autonomy in making that kind of decision. So we were piloting that this year. We're going to continue through the year doing that and see how effective it is. And sometimes those micro grant concepts, that few $100s here and there, our counselors are going to have access to that kind of money in November when students start enrolling for spring, and they owe a little bit of money, and that's keeping them from continuing. And so we're calling it a pilot, an experiment, however you want to phrase it. But we're going to see how that goes, and hopefully it helps kind of address that scenario that you're mentioning there.
Yeah, and I'll just say, with all the schools that I work with and being kind of working with counselors, but also working with, the high school counselors and stuff, I would just say that I think each school does that a little differently, and that really depends on their structure that they have set up. And by that, I mean, I am at a 4-year public institution, and so we have a lot more, I don't want to say restrictions and rules, but we have people we have to answer to at a state level. If you're looking at a private school versus public, those can change things. So I think schools it kind of is a professional judgment in our field of what we can do based on the funds that we're awarded and kind of given. So I think it really just depends on the school structure and what they're looking at. But I know that there are several schools across the state that are actually reevaluating their scholarship awarding right now, just due to the changes to the ACT and how that structure is changing, as well as just knowing that things are changing just with COVID in general. And so I think you're going to see a lot of schools come out with some very different changes, and a lot of test optional I've seen start coming across. So I would say if there's a school that you particularly need to get in contact with, since I am the early awareness chair for MASFAP, I forgot to mention that, but you've seen me before, hopefully. I can get you in contact with a specific school if you're needing it, and get some of those questions answered, and make sure that we can get you to the process. So there's several of us that are in MASFAP, and I'm sure if one of us doesn't know, then we can find somebody that will. So.
Yeah. And if you happen to live in, I'll use Maryville as an example because that's where we are. But if a family from Maryville had financial aid questions and they were planning to go to Mizzou, they're more than welcome to come into the office. I'll sit down, visit with them. I know a handful of people who work in the Mizzou financial aid office, and I can get them connected to those people.
Yeah.
The way the financial aid industry works, it's not a competitive industry. It's we want to help the students, and most of our students that are going to come to Northwest, by the time they get to us in our office, they know they want to be at Northwest, and we're just trying to help them pay. And so it's a very different world than the admissions world, where some things are super top secret and held close.
That is very true. I would say I probably answer more non-Mizzou questions than I do Mizzou questions. So I'm out, I do presentations, and I am at high schools all the time, and I'm like, I don't go to that school, I don't work at that school, but this is how we do it, but call this person. So I will tell Buddy is correct on that 100%. And as financial aid personnel, we just want them to succeed. We want them to be able to not be stressed about the financials. And I think a lot of us, that's really our focus and our goal. And so anything that we can do to answer those questions, no matter if it's our school or another school, I just want you to go to college or, you know, go get your dream job or do whatever it is. If it's a technical school, I just want to make sure that we get you there. So is there any other questions you guys have? You can drop them in the chat. Laura did put my email address in the chat. Email me away. I like answering emails. I will say too, first of all, thank you both Buddy and Becca. I think the information that you gave is unprecedented and very needed at this time. I will also say too that like this is the most unique situation in my 5 years that I've ever been in financial aid. And a lot of things have changed on the fly. You know, like one day everything's great and the next day you're like, man, I don't know if I like my career choice right now. And I know you guys as high school counselors are feeling that same thing, right? Like you're like, man, this is a great day. Kids are doing great. And then the next day you're like, yeah, I need to go to bed. I'll wake up tomorrow, start over. And so I really, truly just want to say like, thank you guys for everything that you guys do. Thank you for my financial aid counterparts for being here and giving up time. I know everyone is busy, but I just hope you all know that we truly are here to support you and support your students and vice versa. If you need something, just let us know. I do have a couple announcements. So here's some resources for you. If you haven't been following St. Louis graduates on Twitter, I highly recommend it. They tweet about their degrees of debt. And I, as a financial aid personnel, find this the most intriguing thing ever. You learn a lot of things that you didn't necessarily like. Becca said, we get a lot of questions about things that have nothing to do with financial aid. So the more you know, just in general, the better off you are. So I would definitely make sure you follow them. MASFAP also has a Twitter. So we tweet as well about kind of things that are coming up, what's kind of going on in the financial aid world. And I think it's a great resource too. So there's some different resources. There's the NCAN for the fall guide on data collection to support. There's the NCAN planning calendar. There's some senior decision trackers. There is the FAFSA preview. If you haven't looked at it yet, I would definitely make sure you get out there and start looking at it. October 1st is next week. Welcome to Financial Crazy in our world. And then there's also the Scholarship Foundation updated FAFSA guide. And so I think if you're looking for resources for your students, these are all great resources. St. Louis Graduate also has a COVID resource page. I will tell you most institutions also have some kind of COVID resource kind of navigation of what they're doing listed on their web pages. We do have to have that out there. So if you're looking at a specific school and kind of what resources they have to help families that are currently enrolled, maybe it's your students that just graduated and they're freshmen and they're like, they don't know who to ask. You can use that as a resource too. So the more resources we can give you, definitely let us know. But if there's something that you're looking for in a resource, you can reach out to me or Laura and we will be happy to get that to you guys. If there's something specific that you're missing. And I like to create resources. So if there's something I got to make for you to help you do your job better, just let me know and I can get that to you.